It is time for the last block in our Beautiful Day Mystery Block of the Month. The name of our block for today is called Gather Round. So gather around and let's make this block together. These are the supplies that we need. I have everything cut out according to the pattern. This pattern is a free pattern. You will find it on my blog, and I have linked to it in the description box below this video. The first thing we are going to do is make half square triangles. Now, if you've watched any of my videos before, you know that I prefer using diagonal seam tape when I am making my half square triangles. I know some of you have different preferences, so I'm going to touch on some of the other ways and some of the other tools we might use when making these blocks. The first thing would be to grab our A squares and our C squares. And if you're reading through the pattern, it says to mark your diagonal lines on the back of your A squares. A great tool for marking diagonal lines when you're making half square triangles is one of these 1/4 inch seam rulers. There are a lot of these different rulers by a number of different manufacturers, and I bet you already have this in your arsenal of quilting supplies, and you may even already be using this little seam ruler frequently. If not, it's a really handy one. I'm going to go ahead and mark one of these squares. Now, some of you may prefer just marking the center diagonal line and then sewing a 1/4 inch seam on either side of your center. This allows you to mark both of your sewing lines because that's a 1/4 inch from either side of the center. And so we have our sewing lines neat and tidy, ready to sew. You would then place this right sides together with C and then sew on both of those sewing lines. It's a real easy way to get started on making those half square triangles. Like I said, I do use diagonal seam tape, so that's the method I'm going to be using, but these rulers are great if you like marking those lines rather than using a notion like the tape I mentioned. Let me finish assembling these half square triangles and I will meet you back here. I am just finishing up trimming these half square triangles, and I saved one so I could cut it on camera for you. But you can see here the ones that I've already cut apart. We're starting out with half square triangles, but we're going to end up with hourglass units or 1/4 square triangle units. You will see them in patterns referenced with either name. It means the same thing. But you start with these half square triangles. You can see how these are going to look once they're pressed. And then we're going to put those together and they're going to turn into hourglass blocks. This is my favorite way to assemble this sort of block. You can use this method whenever you have just 2 fabrics in your block. And you can start with squares rather than cutting individual triangles and sewing those triangles back together. By starting with squares, we eliminate any stretchiness or mostly stretchiness that you can have when dealing with triangles. It's just easier to work with squares. So this is definitely my favorite way to do this. Even if you prefer starting with triangles, you can still make those oversized, just like we are having the oversized squares here, and trim everything down. So having the oversized option really helps you be nice and accurate. I'm gonna trim this last square right here, and then take it over to the iron and press all of these units. We are going to be pressing these towards the dark. So we're going to press those towards our dark fabric, and we don't need to worry about squaring these up just yet. So let them be whatever size they end up at this point in time, and we will trim them in the next step. I am going to go ahead and iron these up and then show you the next sewing step. These half square triangles are pressed, and this is what we do next. We are going to layer 2 half square triangles, right sides together. You'll want to make sure that that seam butts up nice and tight underneath. And you can feel if that is butting nicely or not. So make sure that those are lined up very nicely. You will have a solid on top of a print on both sides. And then just butt those seams up. Okay, now, you're next going to sew a 1/4 inch on either side of the diagonal line. Again, this is a time when I would use the diagonal seam tape, but if you're a marking person, you would go ahead and mark that. You can mark just the center line and then sew your 1/4 inch on either side, or you can mark your sewing lines initially. I'm gonna mark these sewing lines like so, and then I will just go and sew on both sides there. I'm going to repeat this for all 4 pairs and show you what we do next. I am just finishing cutting these blocks apart that I have sewn. One more to go, and then we are going to trim these down. One thing I wanted to mention previously was whenever you are making half square triangles or quarter square triangles, if you ever see in your pattern an 1/8 measurement, maybe it's 5/8, 3/8, 1/8, and those are referencing measurements to cut for either quarter square triangles or half square triangles, you can always round those measurements up before you start sewing together your half square triangles or quarter square triangles. This is just going to give you extra wiggle room when you start to trim those down. Chances are almost 100% if you're seeing a 1/8, 3/8, 5/8, 7/8 measurement in your cutting, for those units, you're seeing an exact measurement. That doesn't allow for very much trimming down. If you want to give yourself a little bit of space to cut those down, round up. You can round up 1/8 just to get to a nice even measurement, or you can round up a quarter, a half, whatever gives you the amount of space that you want to trim those down nicely. Just a tip for when you are making those units. I have these cut at 5.5 inches, which means we already have a little bit of space to cut these down. And that's just what we're going to do right now. Well, I take that back. We're gonna go press these first. I need to press these to one side, and then I will meet you back here and we will trim these up. Now that our pressing is done, we are ready to move on to trimming. There are a few different ways that we can approach trimming this block. I've got a few different rulers I'm gonna talk about, and I'm also gonna talk about my most favorite way to trim these and my least favorite way, because I have a strong least favorite way. Now, when you're reading down through the pattern on page 2, you will see we're trimming these to 4.5 inches square, and our center point is 2.25 inches. That center point measurement is important if you want to try trimming up your blocks using a standard ruler. Something like this Quilter Select 6.5 inch square ruler, for example. This would be a common ruler to pull out to trim these blocks. It's square, it's got the diagonals, and all you really need to know is we're trimming to 4.5, the center point is 2.25. This is probably my least favorite. I'm not even gonna say probably, this is my least favorite way to trim these blocks. I'm just not as accurate when I try to use this method. I do want to show you how to do this because I strongly believe that as quilters, we have a lot of different ways that we can approach doing the same task. And some things are going to work great for me, maybe not as much for you guys, and vice versa. But I like you to know that we have options and we have different tools that we can use. This means that we can tailor how we make the blocks so it works perfectly for our preferences. So if you were going to use something like this ruler, what you would do is you would take your quarter square triangle, untrimmed unit, and you would probably want to go ahead and mark on your ruler where that 2.25 inch measurement is. So from the top, measure over 2.25 and then measure 2.25 down, which is right here. And then you might choose to mark that maybe with a little black dot. You can use just a teeny little Sharpie mark and it will come off if you wanted to, or you can get those little arrows, like washi tape arrows, just to mark exactly where that spot is. Then you would line that spot up on the point of where everything comes together there on your quarter square triangle block. And remembering that we're cutting at 4.5, you would make sure that you have everything lined up. Your diagonal is running right where you want it to. Your point is exactly lined up, and then you would trim the side and the top. You would rotate and you would trim the side and the top again. I'm not even going to bother trimming it like this because I am just never as happy when I trim using this method. But that is how you would approach using just a regular ruler. The next item I'm going to talk about would be just using a 4.5 inch square ruler. Some of you may already have a 4.5 inch square ruler in with your quilting rulers that you use often. It's a pretty common size ruler and it's one many of you may have picked up. If it has the diagonal lines like what you're seeing here, this is wonderful. Still not my favorite way to trim these, because using a ruler that is exactly the size you need it to be, it can be a little bit shifty on you, and it can have a tendency to kind of move around a little bit when you're trimming. But this would be one way. So you would just center everything up. You can see I have the diagonals running here where they're supposed to be. And then you would just trim this up. So I will go ahead and trim this little guy here. And I prefer to pivot and trim from this side rather than trying to trim from the other direction. So I'll line everything up again here, and then trim. And that's what that will look like there. So that's one way to trim. Well, actually the second way to trim, but my favorite way to trim is the June Tailor. I've talked about this ruler, the June Tailor Perfect Half Square and Quarter Square Triangle ruler. I really like using this one. Now, another ruler that you might have, just because it's newer, and I know it's been kind of talked about more frequently, is the Stripology ruler. This is the small one, Stripology Squared Mini. And this one is going to work the same way as the June Tailor. I just find that the heavier markings on this ruler don't allow me to be as accurate. So these two are going to work the same. I'm gonna demo on this one just because I feel like I can be a little bit more accurate using this ruler. But if you have this one, it's gonna work the same way as what I'm showing you with the June Tailor ruler. So for this one, you would just line your diagonals up just like you see here. And it helps if you have one that you didn't just trim. I had trimmed some of these ahead of time, so I had some of them done. Let me grab one that's not trimmed. Okay, now we will line everything up. I was looking at that and I thought, boy, I do not have much room to trim around this one, but it was already a trimmed one. So as you can see here, we do have more space to trim around here. This line right here is 4.5 here, and my 4.5 runs right here on this side. And so it has these nice slots to put your rotary cutter in, and you'll just trim and then pivot and do it again. This is my favorite way to trim these. I find I'm just the most accurate. I like that the markings on this ruler are not super bold, so I can easily see what I'm doing. The only thing I don't like about this ruler, here you can see how nicely that trimmed up. The only thing I don't like about this ruler is it doesn't have markings for every size. So I can't always use this, which means I am resorting to one of those other methods, which is why it's really nice to have different ways to do the same thing. So I'm gonna just finish trimming these up. I have just one more to go. So I will show you this again here. I just find this so nice. And I always use this 60mm rotary cutter. I know a lot of people prefer the 45, but I got started on this 60 and it's pretty much the only one I reach for. Okay. There we go. So that is the last one. After we've got those all trimmed up, we are just going to sew these together in pairs. You're going to put the two darks together and just sew together 4 pairs of 2 quarter square triangles each. We are now ready to lay out our complete block. You will have 4 of these pairs. This center seam should be pressed open. And let's lay those out along with our B and D. So these are going to come across the top, and then 2 of those squares on the sides, the bottom, and then 2 more squares. And then you will just go ahead and sew everything together in rows. The top and the bottom row, those will get pressed away from the center. Your center row will get pressed in towards the center. And then you will press, let me double check those last 2 seams. The last 2 seams get pressed toward the center. I'll finish sewing this up and then I will show you the completed block. And here it is, our completed gather round block. That turned out so cute. And let me show you how the seams look on the back. I know sometimes that's helpful to see. So that's what that looks like. And then the front again. So if you are making the table runner like I am here on the YouTube channel, this is the last block for this quilt along. If you are making the full quilt like what I am showing over on my blog, you will need to make 4 total gather round blocks. Next month, I will be sharing the finishing instructions for the table runner as well as the completed quilt. And I'm excited for you guys to see how all of these blocks come together. All the information for the quilt along can be found down in the description below this video. If you have missed any of the previous months, be sure to check that information out. And I do thank you so much for following along, and I look forward to catching you on the next video.